And now there's much to discuss with our panel, as you might expect. Joining us from Toronto is Jodie Emery. She's a cannabis rights activist who was fined and placed on probation for operating illegal dispensaries in Canada. From Vancouver, Jeremy Szafron is a journalist who created the Green Scene podcast and exclusively covers the cannabis industry. From Sacramento, California, we're joined by Carla Lowe. She's the founder of Citizens Against Legalizing Marijuana. And in the studio with me, Sanho Tree is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and the director of its drug policy project here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to all of you. Jeremy, to you first of all. What is the Cannabis Act in Canada? C-45, they call it. What does it do?
Well, on the surface,
well, essentially, it is here to... Sorry.
Jeremy, yes.
No, I'm so
sorry, Jodie. Sorry, my dear. No, essentially, it is legalization. It's a 400-page document that, let me tell you, dropped last Friday. It took a little bit of time to get through over the weekend. But essentially, it allows us to regulate cannabis sales in the country of Canada. And it's very important to say that for recreational use and try to get minors' hands off of what is out there currently. There's a lot of yellow tape involved in these regulations. The federal government has come out to say, here's what we need to do. These are the guidelines, and then put their further guidelines and regulations to the provinces. And that's kind of where we're at now. The government has said that October 17th will be the day that cannabis is legal in Canada, but it's up to the provinces to legalize in those different jurisdictions.
Yes, and in practical terms, it's 30 grams of dried cannabis that you can share, 4 plants in your home, and you have to buy any of this stuff from a legalized store, right?
Absolutely. Those regulations are going to be quite strict, and as we saw today in British Columbia, the province that I'm currently broadcasting out of, a lot of the stipulations are coming to, they have to go through the government system in order to go to the dispensary, the front line, as it turns out. So the distribution channel is there. That way they understand how much product is there, where it's going. They can kind of see that. And, of course, get taxes from this as well.
And, Jeremy, just very quickly, why did Prime Minister Trudeau take so long to bring what was a campaign promise to fruition? It's quite a while now since his election, isn't it? A couple of years at least.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of the regulations, Health Canada has been working with insiders within the industry for quite some time, looking to understand exactly what this process is. I know years ago, 2 years ago, when this started to talk, there was, dispensaries were being looked at. Different people were kind of coming from Health Canada and saying, I want to understand what the plant is. And you can't really become the first G7 nation to legalize cannabis without looking to our fellows down south and the different places where it's regulated right now. And Washington, for instance, and Colorado or California. And we wanted to kind of learn from those mistakes. And I think that if you talk to the government, they say, we wanted to come out and say, this is what's going to work provincially, federally, and there's a lot of politics involved with that. The Senate was still blocking. The Conservative senators were still trying to block the vote just mere weeks ago.
And Jodie, thank you for jumping in with great enthusiasm at the beginning. We appreciate that very much indeed. But you, having been somebody who in Canada was fined and put on probation for running illegal dispensaries, you must be pretty happy about this, right?
Well, I've spent nearly 15 years campaigning for the legalization of cannabis, and I only spent 10 months from April 2016 onward opening up recreational-style cannabis retail stores. We were demonstrating what legalization should look like. And what we're seeing with the Canadian Federal Legalization Cannabis Act, we're actually seeing more criminal penalties, tougher punishments, an increase in maximums from 7 years to 14 years. And many of the pioneers and advocates and prohibition victims who went to court and campaigned and ran for office, like myself, were being excluded and punished under this new law, and it's only opening up legalization for big business, big government, big money, and a lot of former police and politicians who are getting into the marijuana business to make money, while the people who were arrested and victimized and still being arrested today are being punished under prohibition-style laws. So we have to ask, who is this legalizing cannabis for? Because the Canadian people and taxpayers are still being punished, and with new tough criminal laws, the government is only perpetuating the criminal market that they claim they're trying to eliminate.
Well, there are 45 new laws as a result of this one new law that will come in October. Carla, in Sacramento, California, you as an anti-marijuana campaigner must be looking across the northern border with some trepidation.
You're right. I am. I'm concerned. I've been an anti-marijuana activist as a volunteer for almost 42 years. And basically our mission is to let the public know what this drug is and what it is doing to our young people's developing brains and our communities and our environment. And with the known health hazards now, what's showing up in Colorado is all the data the people of Canada ever need to have to say, wait a minute, Colorado is a failed experiment in legalization. And if you even look at California, we basically have had legalization since Prop 215 was passed in 1996, when so-called, quote, marijuana was accepted as a, quote, medicine. We've had basically legalization because once you have, quote, medical marijuana, there's no difference. A rose is a rose is a rose. And I believe you will have more use. It will be more available, you will have more kids using, and you will have all the problems that Colorado has, and probably even magnified because the THC is so much stronger than it was years and years ago. It's highly addictive, it's long-acting, it's a hallucinogenic drug. It's very addictive. So I'm saying, I'm sorry for Canada, and I'd like to take issue with, I think it was your Prime Minister, who said prohibition didn't work. Well, I take issue with that because during the 1980s in the United States, when there was a real no-use campaign headed by our President Reagan, the use of marijuana among our kids during the 80s went down because during those years they perceived a risk in using. And when there's a risk in using something, you don't use. But now you've opened the floodgate. God bless the people and be with the people of Canada.
Okay, Carla. Sanho in the studio here. Tell us more about the way they legalize cannabis in Uruguay, which is the only other major nation to legalize it across the whole nation.
So they did it in December of 2013. They voted to legalize and to have a state-controlled model. And the idea was to drive the black market out of business. Now, it's important to remember that Uruguay never bothered to criminalize drugs to begin with. So they've always had personal consumption amounts that was basically legalized since the 1970s. What they did was take the state and move into that market and organize a system which rolled out last year where people can pay a low price in government pharmacies for $1.30 a gram, and that drives the black market out of business. So in that sense, what they've done is it's basically the same as before. You're still allowed to consume cannabis as they always have been. Yes. We're just cutting the black market out of this.
They're trying to drive the black market out of business, according to Prime Minister Trudeau, in Canada as well, right?
Exactly. It's important to remember that when we're talking about illegal drugs, whether it's methamphetamines, cocaine, heroin, or cannabis, these are minimally processed chemical and agricultural commodities that cost pennies per dose to produce. There's nothing exotic about any of these substances. They cost very little money to produce. It's the black market and the risk premiums involved that allow these criminal organizations to charge astronomically high prices for these substances.
Just briefly, will Canada be hauled before the United Nations for breaking international treaties? Is that likely to happen in your opinion?
Extremely unlikely. Canada also has other obligations under international treaties to protect the public welfare, children, respect human rights. So those are values that counterbalance drug prohibition. It's also important to remember that the 1961 UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs was written in 1961. Imagine any politician today giving a speech talking about women, talking about LGBT people, talking about indigenous people, using the values and norms of 1961. They would be laughed out of office. They'd have to apologize, if not resign. We've evolved so many ways, but not with respect to drugs.
Carla, you want to come in?
Yeah, I would like to respond. I think it was an interesting point he made mention of 1961. There's an incredibly significant difference, critical. The marijuana, the THC level, and that's the fat-soluble ingredient in cannabis, THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, that's what gets you high. That's what you pay for. The THC in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s was about 1% THC. That is an entirely different drug than we're talking about today.
Okay.
But wait, it's critical because you're making a comparison that what people talked about in the 60s can't possibly relate to today. And he's right, because it's far more critical.
Carla, we'll come back to you. You want to answer?
Thank you.
Yes, it just means that people consume less of it to achieve the same effect.
Yeah.
By Carla's logic, then people would consume grain alcohol entirely and completely avoid beer and wine. But people don't do that. They deliberately go and seek the lower potency substances.
Carla, we have a tweet for you from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He said, "It's been too easy for our kids to get marijuana and for criminals to reap the profits. Today, we change that. Our plan to legalize and regulate marijuana just passed the Senate. #promise kept." So, Carla, by breaking the black market and legalizing sales like wine and spirits are, how is that going to reduce the danger to young kids who may be trying to dabble in it?
California currently has about 35,000 grows, and it's all illegal marijuana, because only in January of this year did we have pass our Proposition 64 went into effect. California uses about 8% of the marijuana that's grown. The rest of it is shipped across the country. The black market in California is alive and well. We are a cartel, far surpassing any cartels in any other part of this world.
Well, Jeremy, what do you say to that? I mean, Prime Minister Trudeau has literally hung his hat on the notion of breaking the black market and in regulating the industry. So just like with wines and spirits, you give great incentives to those who are the salespeople not to sell it to young people. But Carla's saying that ain't happening in California.
Yeah, well, I think education is very, very important. If we look to different places where cannabis has been regulated and legalized, education is very important. It's crucial. We need to understand that kids have access to this kind of stuff, and we need to educate them about it. And now there's public campaigns. Just because this was under prohibition means that we couldn't really talk about it. It's the same reason we couldn't really research it. And going back to that notion of high THC counts, it's worth noting that the Canadian legalization legislation that's come out does not regulate THC content within the dry herb itself. So you can have pretty high dose THC.
Well, that's a good point.
Edibles won't be legal in Canada for a year. Yeah, edibles and vaporizers won't be legal in Canada for at least a year. That's what they're saying, or within a year. But yeah, no, I think that yeah.
Just because you said you're educating is so important. Just for a fact, for your listeners, your viewers, the street pot in Sacramento, where I am today, is 20 to 25% THC. The edibles are 40, 50, 60%. Those are the gummy bears and the candies and the juices, the sodas, and vaping. Vaping is very popular because nobody knows what's going on. That's pure, 95, 98% THC.
10 milligrams.
And we are telling you this is a serious drug and you have a major problem.
Well, let's get Jodie to answer that question. Jodie, it's a serious drug and you have a major problem in Canada after October. And isn't it true that just by increasing the number, I mean, 10% of Canadians are involved in pot culture at the moment. This is going to increase that number exponentially, isn't it? And so therefore, aren't you by the back door endangering young people again?
Not at all, because cannabis doesn't endanger young people. In fact, teachers and researchers and parents are providing cannabis oil to children, which stops their epilepsy seizures and helps them live a healthier, happier lifestyle. Cannabis is medicine and has been used as medicine even for thousands of years in China. The oldest plants and cannabis buds that we have record of are found in China. The most ancient human researchers we found that cannabis and humanity have evolved together. But let's pretend for a minute that cannabis is as dangerous as alcohol. Well, tougher laws don't make it...
way more dangerous, because
it's not, but let me please finish.
It's
what I'm going to say,
Jodie. It stays
what I'm going
in the
to
brain
say to you right now is that a lot of professionals and experts and business people are very successful and use cannabis on a regular basis. I myself have used it quite frequently today and every day. And what I want to point out is, even if you're right that cannabis is dangerous and deadly and kills people, tough laws do not prevent it. Tough laws do not make it safer. Harsh criminal penalties and restrictive prohibitive regulations only increase the risk involved in being engaged with it. As we heard Sanho say, that it's pennies per gram to produce this plant. But when the government increases the penalty and the risk, they increase the reward. And when you increase the risk-reward, you get unsavory, dangerous people involved. And good people will say, I'm not willing to go to jail for 20 years, but a gangster will say, thank you, government, for increasing the price of this plant so I can sell it for a lot of money. So we have to talk about what the black market really is. It's the creation of the government laws. When they criminalize something, they create the criminal market. The only way to get rid of the black market in cannabis is to legalize it and regulate it with reasonable regulations that allow peaceful, non-violent people to engage. And for the record, the Justice Department of Canada admits that 95% of all cannabis growers are not connected to gangs and organized crime. They're peaceful Canadians who are punished by the law.
I would like to talk about the grows. I would like to talk about the impact of the growing on the environment.
Prohibition problem.
Please listen. This is absolutely critical. If you don't care about what the marijuana is doing to our kids' developing brains or the increase in accidents, the drug drivers, listen, please, to what's happening to the environment. I encourage you to Google silent poison and look at this study that's been done in the county next to mine, where they document the devastation of the pesticides and the rodenticides and the products that are used by the growers.
Which is why we're regulating.
And it's a prohibition problem. It's a prohibition problem, not a cannabis problem. It's a plant.
The carbofuran that's being used is highly toxic, highly illegal. It's known that 1/8 of a teaspoon will bring down a 300-pound bear. And if you're not concerned about the contaminants on the marijuana, and by the way, 20 out of 20 samples of medical marijuana in the Sacramento area were found to be full of contaminants. But do you realize the water shed, the water into which these products are pouring? This is the water that in California, Northern California, where I am, is feeding the watersheds of the state. So be wary of the grows is my important message, and the impact to the environment and to the rescuers and the responders who to go in to enforce the tight laws you're going to have.
Carla, thank you for that message.
Yes,
Jeremy, one of the most pressing issues, certainly after this law comes in October, is the fate of Canadians who already possess criminal records for possession. What action would you like to see done for those people?
Well, for a number of years, I've been asking for... oh, I'm sorry, I mixed up Jodie and Jeremy.
That's okay, Jodie and Jeremy. It's a close name, Jodie. No, how about I start and then you can finish up, Jodie. I just want to say that the government has been fairly clear on where they're going to take this. It's going to be an individual approach, which doesn't really necessarily explain where they're going to take it. But as Jodie did mention, there's a lot of this kind of Bill Blair, the guy that was running our legalization efforts within Canada, used to be the Toronto police chief. There are a lot of people now in the private sector that came out of putting people behind bars that are allowed to operate within this new regulated system and not have any type of criminal record. So there is a little bit of that. The NDP, which is one of the oppositional governments in Canada, has called out Canada and the Prime Minister Trudeau to make sure to say, hey, what you're doing is not fair. Up until October 17th, you can still decriminalize the people that have had these types of actions. And that's just for simple possession charges. We still don't know what are going to happen for trafficking.
Well, Jodie, do you think this is something that the politicians, despite what Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, has said, that he wants to wait until the law is actually enacted, do you think that that is something that they are going to have to look at down the road regarding marijuana?
Absolutely. 5 years ago, Justin Trudeau said the first thing to do is to stop arresting people and stop wasting $500 million a year on law enforcement. That was 5 years ago. Justin Trudeau has overseen $2 billion himself being spent. Okay. This Prime Minister also passed a joint. Passing a joint is trafficking under the law. My husband, Mark Emery, spent 3 months in jail for passing a joint. So Justin Trudeau, if he truly believes in fairness, would have stopped the arrests immediately. We need cannabis amnesty for all peaceful, non-violent pot criminals. And I should say that California and other jurisdictions are looking at reducing the punishments of people for non-just possession, but beyond possession, people who are non-violent, peaceful cannabis criminals.
Sanho, what about the other issue, the American-Canadian border? 400,000 crossings a day there. After October, there's going to be a very big difference between the two nations, certainly at the federal level, regarding the issue of marijuana. What's going to happen?
Well, the Trump administration has been increasing harassment of people coming from Canada in terms of seizing their electronics, going through their social media accounts to see if they've been involved in cannabis in any way. And it seems to be increasing. It's very, very troubling. But at the same time, it's one of our largest trading partners, and this is going to bog down trade and commerce tremendously.
There's a difference in the way that the product is marketed as well, isn't there? In America, there's a lot of flash television advertising and billboard posters, and in Canada, it's much quieter than that.
Yeah, the regulations are still being rolled out, but in the U.S. as well, they try to contain a lot of that advertising in terms of where and how you advertise it. But there are also a lot of border states that have legalized as well. So you have Washington State, you have Maine, you have Vermont, which just legalized this past week. So it's not like they're keeping cannabis out of the country by policing these borders. They're just harassing people who are honest in answering those questions.
Carla, there's a difference between what the president seems to be saying, which is that he's saying that he supports the states taking the lead in this, whereas his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, is saying the opposite, or appears to be saying the opposite. Do you think there are going to be more states coming on board, adding to the 9 that already allow recreational marijuana in this country?
The reason that the states are able to pass legislation is they are funded. The funding for the pro-pot movement. I don't know how Jodie gets her money or what the industry is in Canada, but George Soros is one of the key players. That's money we cannot touch when we try to tell the truth. When we try to tell the truth about what's happening to the unborn, the developing fetus, the birth defects that are showing up in Colorado, the psychotic breaks that are now becoming daily news of our young people, parents who are speaking out, finally saying, wait a minute, we had no idea what this drug was. We had no idea what it's been doing to our kids. So yes, we have to rely on your television program to give people like me the equal opportunity to say what this drug is and what it's doing and why it's so critically imperative that people learn the truth about the drug, not about the money, because that's a given.
Jodie, we have 2 minutes left. You can respond to that. It's worth bearing in mind, isn't it, that in America it's a cash industry, and in Canada, because it's a federally it will be under federal law, not illegal anymore, the banks are involved. So you're likely to see greater expansion, right? More jobs, more investment, presumably.
Oh, well, certainly there's a lot of financial opportunities coming out of this, but again, it's being limited to the people who are big business and big government and those who are already in advantageous positions, whereas all the victims of prohibition, the people who are of color or indigenous or already marginalized and held down and persecuted, they should have an equal opportunity to create jobs and enjoy jobs and all of the benefits. But no, it's being denied by government and big business, and they get to profit and increase police budgets for cracking down on cannabis. Meanwhile, not $1 is being spent addressing the unfairness of the system that Justin Trudeau himself admits is a racist, unjust system.
Carla, can you do it in 20 seconds for me? You got 20 seconds.
It's this population that she just mentioned, the down and outers, the underserved. It's this population that the drug culture is turning to. They are preying upon them because those people are the ones who are not very well stated at this point, and they have no position to go but down because of illegal marijuana.
And Jeremy, finally, just the big picture, Jeremy, the big picture. How do the Canadian people feel about this? It's a big sea change coming up. 10 seconds. Yeah,
well, Canadians are about this. We're about legalization, quite frankly, as long as it's done and rolled out in an appropriate way. That again, and going back to this, what is regulation? We're able to control what goes on to cannabis plants now in terms of pesticides and fungicides and all that kind of good stuff that people really want.
Jeremy, Jodie, Carla, Sanho, spirited discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And that's it from this edition of The Heat. I'm John Terrett in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.